Rowan Whitmore never meant for anyone to see that message. It was supposed to be a private joke, something tossed off in the safety of a friendship that had survived college dorms, bad breakups, and a decade of Seattle winters. He typed it fast, thumb moving without thought, the words spilling out of a mind loosened by exhaustion and rain. If you smiled at me even once, I think I would quit my job on the spot. He meant to send it to Marcus. He did not send it to Marcus. Somewhere between the blur of contact names and the tiredness behind his eyes, his thumb landed on a different thread entirely, one he had not opened in weeks, one that belonged to a woman the entire company referred to, quietly and with a kind of reverent fear, as the Ice Queen. The message left his phone with a soft, cheerful whoosh, a sound that under any other circumstance would have meant nothing at all. For 3 seconds, Rowan simply stared at the screen, waiting for his brain to catch up with what his hand had done. Then the delivered marker changed to scene, and something in his chest dropped the way a floor drops in an old elevator, fast and without warning. He read the name at the top of the thread twice, as if repetition might undo reality. Celeste Ashford, Chief Executive Officer of Ashford Meridian Holdings, the real estate empire whose glass towers had reshaped half the skyline he designed buildings for. A woman he had exchanged perhaps a dozen professional messages with over the better part of a year, always about permits, always about sustainable material sourcing, always signed with nothing more personal than her initials. And now she had just received a message meant for his best friend, a message that told her, in no uncertain terms, that her smile would be enough to end his career. The rain outside his apartment window had not stopped all evening. A fine, patient drizzle that blurred the lights of downtown into soft gold smears against the glass. Rowan lived alone in a converted loft near Pioneer Square, the kind of space an architect built for himself when he finally had the means to stop renting other people's mistakes. He had lived alone for a long time now, ever since the accident that took his wife Hannah 4 years earlier, an accident he rarely spoke about and never explained, unless someone asked twice. He had no children waiting for him in the other room, no noise beyond the hum of the refrigerator and the tap of rain against old brick. His evenings were quiet by design, filled with blueprints and the low murmur of jazz records. And it was precisely that quiet, that ordinary tiredness, that had made him careless with his thumb. At work, people described Rowan Whitmore in almost contradictory terms. Junior architects said he was the only senior partner who actually remembered their names. Contractors said he was stubborn about material quality to the point of being difficult, and then admitted, almost sheepishly, that his buildings never leaked, never cracked, never aged the way cheaper work did. He had built a reputation over 15 years as a designer obsessed with sustainability long before it became fashionable, the kind of architect who would rather redesign an entire wing than compromise on a single window's insulation. He hated flattery. He hated small talk that existed only to extract a favor. He had turned down 2 lucrative offers from firms that wanted him mostly for his name because he could smell insincerity from across a room, and there was nothing in the world that exhausted him faster. What Rowan did not know, could not have known, was that Celeste Ashford had specifically requested his firm for the redevelopment of the old waterfront warehouses, and had done so after reading through nearly a year of his design proposals, memos, and site notes. She had never told anyone this. She had never told him this. To the outside world, Celeste Ashford was simply the woman who ran one of the largest real estate portfolios on the West Coast, with a discipline that bordered on ruthlessness, a woman who had never once been photographed smiling in a boardroom, a woman whose reputation for coldness had become so absolute that new hires were warned about her before they even received their employee badges. Earlier that same evening, before the fatal message, Rowan had spent 2 hours finishing structural revisions for a mixed-use development near the Sound, the kind of project that would take up an entire year of his life and half his sanity. He had stayed late at the office, not because anyone asked him to, but because a junior designer named Priya had been struggling with load calculations on a cantilevered section, and he had refused to leave until she understood the logic behind every number. That was simply who he was. He gave his time freely to people who needed it and asked for nothing in return. a habit that had earned him a quiet kind of loyalty throughout the firm. Even from people who barely knew him, he had declined, as he always did, the invitation to the firm's autumn networking mixer, a glittering affair on the top floor of a hotel downtown, all champagne and forced laughter and executives trying to outcharm one another. Marcus had texted him about it first, half joking, half genuinely concerned. "When is the last time you actually talked to a woman who wasn't a client?" Marcus had written. Rowan had laughed at his desk, alone, the sound swallowed by the empty office around him. He typed his reply with the ease of someone who trusted his audience completely, never imagining for a single moment that the wrong window was open on his screen. That was the moment the world tilted. That was the message that left his hands and entered Celeste Ashford's phone at exactly the wrong hour. On exactly the wrong night, when she happened to be sitting alone in her own apartment, 40 floors above the city, idly turning her phone over in her hand, waiting for a sleep that rarely came easily to her anymore. For a long moment after he saw the word "seen," Rowan simply sat frozen on his couch, phone in hand, rain ticking softly against the window like a clock, counting down something inevitable. His mind ran through every possible outcome, most of them ending in unemployment, public humiliation, or both. He considered calling the office in a panic, decided against it, considered sending an apology, decided that might make things worse, considered simply throwing the phone into the Puget Sound and moving to another state under a different name. None of these options felt adequate to the size of the disaster. He set the phone down on the coffee table as if it had grown suddenly radioactive and stared at it, and waited for it to explode with some kind of retribution he could not yet name. 5 minutes passed. He would remember later that he counted every single one of them, the second hand of the antique clock above his bookshelf, ticking with what felt like deliberate cruelty. Then there was a knock at his door. 3 sharp, unhurried raps that carried an authority entirely disproportionate to their volume. Rowan's stomach dropped for the second time that night. Nobody visited him at this hour. Marcus would have texted first. His neighbors were older and asleep by 9. He crossed the living room slowly, his bare feet silent on the hardwood, and opened the door with the particular dread of a man who already suspects exactly who is standing on the other side. Celeste Ashford stood in the hallway in a black tailored coat, rain still beaded on her shoulders, her dark hair damp at the edges from the walk between her car and his building. She had not called ahead. She had not sent a warning message. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable in the way that had made grown executives stumble over their own words in board meetings, and looked at him with an intensity that made him forget, for one absurd second, that he was still wearing sweatpants and a faded university sweatshirt. Her eyes moved over his face, as though she were reading something written there. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, even, and utterly without anger. "Say that again," she said. Rowan opened his mouth and produced no sound whatsoever. He had rehearsed several versions of an apology in the 5 minutes since the message went through, each one more desperate than the last, and every single one of them evaporated the instant she said those 3 words. He stood in his own doorway, blinking at the most powerful woman in Seattle's real estate world, and felt, for possibly the first time in his adult life, entirely out of his depth, every account of what happened afterward. And there would eventually be many accounts, some accurate and most wildly exaggerated. Agreed on one detail. Celeste Ashford did not raise her voice, did not threaten legal action, did not so much as mention the phrase human resources. She simply stood in the doorway of a man she barely knew, having driven across half the city in the rain because of 9 accidental words, and waited to hear whether he would say them again. The message had read, in full, "If you smiled at me even once, I think I would quit my job on the spot." He had written it about no one in particular, a throwaway line meant to needle his best friend about the absurdity of corporate crushes. And now the woman it had landed on instead, Fantway with rain in her hair, asking him to repeat it, and Rowan understood, somewhere beneath the panic, that his entire evening had just become something far stranger and far more consequential than a simple mistake. He managed, eventually, something close to words. "He is sorry." he said. "Deeply sorry. It was meant for a friend. A joke. Nothing more." He can explain the whole embarrassing chain of events if she would just come inside out of the rain and let him make her a cup of coffee while he does it. Celeste studied him for another long moment, as if weighing whether his stammering apology was performance or genuine, and then, to his complete astonishment, the corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the architecture of one. The first few lines of a structure that had not been built in a very long time. She stepped inside without being asked twice, shook the rain from her coat, and told him, in the same flat, businesslike tone she used to close 9-figure deals, that she was not here about his job, and she was not here to report him to anyone. She was here, she said, because in 11 years of running a company that people either feared or flattered, no one had ever accidentally told her something honest. Rowan made the coffee anyway, mostly because his hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. The kitchen was small, all warm wood and open shelving he had built himself over a long weekend 2 years earlier. And Celeste watched him move through it with the same careful attention she gave to blueprints, noting the economy of his movements, the way he measured grounds without looking, the quiet competence of a man used to doing things properly even when no one was watching. She had read his design proposals for months. She had approved his firm for the waterfront project, specifically because his notes revealed a mind that cared more about how a building would feel to the people inside it than how it would photograph for a magazine spread. She had never told him this, and she did not tell him now. Instead they talked, at first stiffly, about nothing important. He asked why she had come herself, instead of sending a strongly worded message through legal, and she said, with a dryness that surprised him, that legal would have made it a disaster, and she preferred to handle disasters personally. He asked how she even had his home address, and she admitted, almost embarrassed, that the firm's project files listed it for site coordination purposes, and she had simply looked it up before she could talk herself out of the impulse. It was, she said, the least professional thing she had done in a decade. As the coffee cooled between them, the conversation loosened. Rowan told her about the design he had wrestled with all evening, the cantilever that refused to balance until Priya finally saw the error in her own math. Celeste told him, unprompted, that she remembered reading his notes on that very project, and had privately thought his insistence on natural light over cost efficiency was either reckless or brilliant, and had not yet decided which. He laughed, actually laughed, the sound loosening something in his chest that had been coiled tight since the moment he saw the word "seen" appear beneath his message. For the first time that evening, the panic in the room had fully dissolved, replaced by something neither of them had words for yet. It was nearly midnight when Celeste finally stood to leave, coat still faintly damp, and paused at the door with her hand on the frame. She turned back to look at him, and this time the almost smile from earlier completed itself, brief and startling, like sunlight breaking through cloud cover that had not parted in years. "Say it again sometime," she told him, "when you actually mean to send it to me." Then she was gone, down the hallway and into the elevator, leaving Rowan standing in his doorway with a cold cup of coffee and the strange, disorienting sensation that his entire life had just quietly rearranged itself around one accidental sentence. He did not sleep much that night. He lay awake replaying the conversation, turning over the specific weight of her attention, the surprising warmth beneath the reputation everyone at the office whispered about like a ghost story. He told himself, several times, that this had been an isolated incident, a strange collision of circumstance that would settle back into its proper professional shape by morning. He was wrong, though it would take several more days for him to understand exactly how wrong. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at his office with no return address, delivered by courier rather than mail. Inside was a single card, handwritten in a precise, slanted script that his assistant later confirmed matched signatures on file for Ashford Meridian Holdings. "Dinner," it read, "no titles, no company talk, no one else needs to know." A time and a restaurant followed, a small place tucked into a quiet street in Capitol Hill, the kind of restaurant that photographed poorly, and therefore attracted almost no one who cared about being seen. Rowan stared at the card for a long time before folding it carefully and slipping it into his jacket pocket, where it stayed. worn slightly soft at the corners. For the rest of the week, he told no one, not even Marcus. Though Marcus noticed his friend had begun smiling at his phone in a way he had not done in years, and drew his own private conclusions. The dinner, when it finally arrived, unfolded nothing like Rowan had imagined. He had pictured stiff formality, perhaps a continuation of the strange interrogation from that rainy doorway, Celeste probing him for some hidden motive she suspected lurked beneath his accidental honesty. Instead, she arrived in a simple gray sweater, hair loose instead of pulled back into the severe knot she wore in board meetings, and set a single condition before they had even ordered. No company talk, no titles, no mention of the waterfront project or quarterly earnings, or anything that could be found in a press release. She wanted, she told him plainly, to know what kind of person he was when nobody important was watching. So he told her about growing up in a small logging town 3 hours north. About a father who taught him to measure twice and cut once before he could ride a bicycle. About the summer he spent apprenticing under an old carpenter who believed a house should last longer than the family that built it. He told her about losing Hannah, carefully, without asking for sympathy, simply as fact, the way a person learns to speak about grief once the sharpest edges have worn smooth with time. Celeste listened without interrupting, her fork forgotten beside her plate, and when he finished, she told him, quietly, that she understood something about learning to live around an absence rather than through it, though she did not elaborate further that night. In return, she gave him fragments, small and careful, of a woman rarely permitted to exist outside the armor she wore to work each morning. She told him about the engagement that ended 3 years earlier, not with tears but with a discovery. The kind that made a person question every warm word ever spoken to them. She told him she had built the Ice Queen reputation deliberately, brick by brick, because a woman running a company that size could not afford to be seen as soft, could not risk being underestimated the way she had once been underestimated by everyone, including herself. She had not smiled in a company photograph in 4 years. She could not remember, she admitted, the last time she had laughed at dinner the way she had laughed twice already tonight. For 2 hours, in a restaurant that photographed poorly and therefore attracted no attention, Celeste Ashford was simply a woman having dinner with a man who made her laugh, and Rowan Whitmore was simply a man discovering, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that the person behind the company's most feared reputation was lonelier than anyone in that building could possibly imagine. Neither of them noticed the man at the corner table with a phone angled just slightly too carefully in their direction, nor the flash that caught them both leaning toward each other in a moment of unguarded laughter, a photograph that would be circulating through half the executives at Ashford Meridian Holdings before either of them finished their coffee the next morning. The image appeared first on an anonymous industry gossip account that specialized in trading precisely this kind of currency, a blurry but unmistakable photograph captioned with a question mark, and the two names everyone in commercial real estate would recognize instantly. By 9 in the morning, it had traveled through half the firm's internal messaging channels, forwarded with commentary ranging from gleeful curiosity to open suspicion. By 10, Graham Mercer, the company's chief financial officer, had already scheduled an emergency meeting with legal to discuss what he termed a serious conflict of interest concerning an outside contractor and the chief executive officer. Graham had never trusted Rowan, not really, not since the firm first won the waterfront contract over 2 other, cheaper bids. He operated from a simple worldview in which every unusual arrangement concealed some hidden angle, some scheme designed to extract value from the company he had spent 20 years protecting. A photograph of Celeste Ashford laughing at dinner with the very architect overseeing a 9-figure development was, to Graham's mind, not a coincidence but a confirmation of everything he had quietly suspected. He marched into the emergency meeting prepared to recommend an immediate audit of Rowan's contract, his invoices, and every line item his firm had submitted over the past year. Bianca Hale, Celeste's assistant of 6 years, watched the entire episode unfold, with an expression that suggested she found the panic considerably more entertaining than alarming. She had noticed, months earlier, the subtle shift in her employer's mood whenever Rowan's firm submitted new project files, the way Celeste read his notes twice instead of once, the faint, almost imperceptible warmth that crept into her voice during site visits. She had no strict obligation to attend personally. Bianca had said nothing to anyone, because it was not her business to say, but she had allowed herself, privately, the small satisfaction of hoping the two of them might eventually figure out what she had already guessed. Victor Sloan learned of the photograph within the hour. And unlike Graham's genuine, if misguided, alarm, Victor's reaction contained something closer to opportunity. Victor ran a rival design firm that had lost the waterfront bid to Rowan 18 months earlier, a defeat he had never fully accepted and had spent considerable energy quietly resenting ever since. He understood immediately that a scandal involving the chief executive officer and her architect could accomplish what his original proposal had failed to achieve, casting enough doubt over Rowan's professionalism to potentially reopen the bidding process altogether. He began making calls that same afternoon. Careful, deniable calls to board members and industry contacts, planting seeds of suspicion with the practiced patience of a man who had learned that reputations, unlike buildings, could be dismantled with remarkably little material. Celeste, when informed of the photograph and the whispers spreading through her own company, did something almost nobody expected. She said nothing at all. She did not issue a statement, did not call an emergency board meeting, did not summon Rowan to her office for damage control. She simply continued through her scheduled day with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything, giving the rumor mill nothing to feed on beyond speculation, which frustrated Graham considerably more than any explanation could have. Rowan, unaware of the photograph until Marcus sent it to him with several exclamation points and a string of questions he had no intention of answering honestly, felt the familiar cold drop return to his stomach. He understood immediately what this meant for his firm's reputation, for the careful professional distance he had always maintained with clients, for the credibility he had spent 15 years building without a single hint of scandal attached to his name. He made the decision, that same afternoon, to withdraw quietly from any direct communication with Celeste, sending project updates only through official channels, avoiding site visits where their paths might cross, treating the entire episode as something to be waited out, rather than confronted. For nearly a week, this strategy appeared to work. The gossip account posted no follow-up. The internal rumors began to soften into other, fresher scandals, as office attention wandered elsewhere, and Rowan allowed himself to believe the storm had passed without lasting damage. He told himself this was for the best, that whatever strange, warm thing had begun between them in that rain-soaked doorway had simply been a beautiful accident, not meant to survive contact with the real world of boardrooms and rival firms and men like Graham Mercer, who saw conspiracy in every unguarded laugh. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon, Celeste appeared unannounced at his firm's downtown office, walking past the receptionist with the same unhurried authority she brought to every room she entered, and asked, in front of 3 junior designers who would later describe the moment to anyone who would listen, to speak with Rowan Whitmore privately. In his office, door closed, she did not raise the subject of the photograph immediately. She asked instead why he had gone silent, why his project updates had turned suddenly formal and distant, after a dinner that had felt, to her at least, like the first honest evening she had spent with another person in years. Rowan explained, carefully, that he was trying to protect both of them, that a scandal could damage her company and his firm equally, that perhaps the wisest course was distance until the rumors exhausted themselves naturally. Celeste listened to all of this with visible patience, and then told him, with the same directness that had brought her to his doorway weeks earlier, that she had not built a company from nothing by running from difficult conversations, and she had no intention of starting now. It was during this conversation, quiet and unguarded behind a closed office door, that Celeste finally explained the engagement that had ended 3 years earlier, in fuller detail than she had offered at dinner. His name had been Preston Cole, a name she rarely spoke aloud even now, a man who had courted her for 2 years with a patience she mistook for genuine devotion, only to be discovered. Eventually, siphoning confidential merger information to a competing firm through the access her trust had granted him. The betrayal had not simply ended a relationship, it had rewired something fundamental in how she approached every person who entered her orbit afterward, teaching her to assume hidden motives until proven otherwise. to read warmth as a potential weapon rather than a gift. What made Rowan different, she told him, was not grand gestures or persistent charm. It was the accumulation of small refusals. He had never once asked her for expedited permits, though his firm certainly could have used the advantage. He had never mentioned the waterfront contract during their dinner, though it represented the largest project of his career. He had never, in all their accidental and then deliberate meetings, asked her for anything at all beyond her honest attention. And in a world where nearly everyone wanted something from her, that particular absence had become, to Celeste, the most convincing evidence of sincerity she had ever encountered. Rowan, listening to all of this, understood for the first time the true weight of what had grown between them. Not a passing curiosity born from an accidental text message, but something that had settled into both their lives with quiet, stubborn permanence. He told her, honestly, that he had gone quiet, not out of doubt about her, but out of fear that his presence might cost her something she had built her entire adult life to protect. Celeste's response was simple. She told him that she had spent 3 years protecting herself from precisely this kind of vulnerability, and she was tired, finally, of calling that protection a victory. They did not resolve everything that afternoon, but something had shifted permanently in the room by the time she left. And Rowan understood that, whatever storm was still gathering outside his office door, he no longer intended to face it by retreating into silence. The storm, as it turned out, was already gathering with considerably more force than either of them realized. Victor Sloan had spent the intervening week doing more than spreading whispers among board members. He had gained access, through a contact still embedded in Rowan's own firm, to an early draft of the structural revisions for the waterfront project, the same calculations Rowan had spent that fateful evening helping Priya correct. Victor altered several key figures in the load-bearing specifications, subtle enough to pass a cursory review, dangerous enough to raise serious safety concerns if implemented as written, and arranged for this altered draft to surface during an upcoming project review meeting, timed precisely to coincide with the peak of the scandal surrounding Rowan and Celeste's relationship. The board meeting, when it arrived, felt to Rowan like an ambush the moment he walked into the room. Graham Mercer presented the altered documents with barely concealed satisfaction, framing the discrepancies not as a simple engineering error but as evidence of carelessness born from divided attention, implying without stating outright that Rowan's focus had drifted from his professional obligations toward matters that had nothing to do with architecture. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. A junior member of the review committee, clearly primed beforehand, suggested aloud that perhaps the firm's contract deserved reconsideration given the apparent lapse in quality control. Rowan defended himself as best he could, pointing out that the figures presented did not match his firm's official submission, that something had clearly been altered somewhere between his desk and the boardroom table. He asked to compare the presented documents against his own saved files, only to be told, with practiced regret, that the timeline for the meeting did not permit such a detour, that the board needed answers today, rather than assurances that verification would come later. But without proof in hand, his objections sounded, even to his own ears, exactly like the kind of desperate deflection a guilty man might offer. He watched the room's collective opinion tilt slowly against him, felt the weight of 15 years of careful reputation trembling under the pressure of a single meeting, and understood, with a sinking clarity, that Victor's plan had been designed precisely for this moment, when suspicion about his personal life would make suspicion about his professional integrity feel inevitable rather than absurd. Throughout the entire presentation, Celeste said nothing. She sat at the head of the table, expression unreadable in the way that had once terrified junior executives and now, to Rowan's growing dismay, seemed to suggest she was reconsidering everything she had told him days earlier in his office. He watched her face for some sign of support and found only the same careful neutrality she brought to every difficult negotiation. And for the first time since the rainy night that had begun all of this, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps he had misjudged the depth of what existed between them, if perhaps her earlier warmth had simply been curiosity that could not survive the pressure of public scrutiny. The meeting seemed poised to end with a formal recommendation to suspend Rowan's firm pending a full audit. Graham already gathering his papers with the satisfied efficiency of a man who believed his suspicions thoroughly vindicated. It was at this exact moment, just as the board secretary began drafting language for the formal motion, that Celeste finally spoke, her voice cutting through the room with a quiet authority that stopped every other conversation instantly. She asked, simply, to see the building's security footage from the file server room for the previous 72 hours. Graham's confident expression flickered, just slightly. A hesitation so brief most of the room missed it entirely, though Rowan did not. Celeste explained, with the same measured calm she brought to every decision, that discrepancies of this precision rarely occurred by accident, and that before the board took any action against a firm with 15 years of unblemished work, they owed themselves the diligence of confirming exactly how the altered documents had entered the review process in the first place. The room fell silent while a technician was summoned, and the footage, once pulled up on the main conference screen, told a story considerably different from the one Graham had presented. The recording showed, with unambiguous clarity, a member of Victor Sloan's firm entering the server room 2 nights earlier, using credentials that should not have granted him access, credentials later traced back to a temporary consulting arrangement Victor had quietly negotiated months prior, ostensibly for an unrelated project, in reality laying the groundwork for exactly this kind of sabotage. The footage showed the file being accessed, modified, and replaced within 11 minutes, time-stamped precisely to align with the version Graham had presented as evidence of Rowan's negligence. The room absorbed this revelation in stages, disbelief, giving way to a kind of collective embarrassment, as board members who had nodded along with Graham's accusations now recalculated their positions in real time. Graham himself sat frozen, the color draining slowly from his face as he understood, evidently, for the first time, how thoroughly he had been maneuvered into serving as an unwitting instrument of Victor's campaign against a rival. Celeste did not gloat. She did not raise her voice or indulge in the kind of triumphant speech the moment might have permitted. She simply stated, with the flat finality of someone closing a file for the last time, that Victor Sloan's firm would be immediately and permanently barred from any future contracts with Ashford Meridian Holdings, and that legal would be pursuing whatever remedies the situation warranted. Then she turned to the rest of the board and said something that would be repeated throughout the company for months afterward, quoted and requoted until it achieved a kind of institutional legend. "The only person in this entire process," she said, "who never once lied to me is the man you just tried to punish for it." The boardroom fell into a silence so complete that Rowan could hear the faint hum of the building's climate control system, could hear his own pulse in his ears, could hear, distantly, the sound of 15 years of careful, patient work finally being recognized in a room that had, minutes earlier, seemed prepared to dismantle it entirely. Graham offered a stiff, mumbled apology before excusing himself from the remainder of the meeting, and the board secretary quietly withdrew the draft motion she had begun preparing only minutes before. What happened next, Rowan would later describe to Marcus as the single strangest moment of his professional life. Celeste, still standing at the head of the table, asked him directly, in front of the entire assembled board, to join her at the front of the room. He rose slowly, uncertain what remained to be said after the dramatic reversal that had just unfolded, and crossed the length of the conference table under the curious eyes of executives who, only minutes earlier, had been prepared to end his career. Celeste waited until he stood beside her before speaking again, and this time her tone shifted, softening in a way that made several board members exchange startled glances, unaccustomed as they were to hearing anything resembling warmth from the woman they had spent years calling the Ice Queen. She told the room, plainly, that several weeks earlier she had received a message meant for someone else entirely. A small, accidental confession of admiration that had somehow, against every rational expectation, led her to a conversation more honest than any she could remember having in years. She did not repeat the message verbatim, though several people in the room would later swear they knew exactly what it said, the story having already circulated in fragmentary, exaggerated versions through half the company. She turned to Rowan and asked whether the message still held, Whether the accidental sentence that had brought her to his doorway in the rain remained true, now that the rain had long since stopped and the storm it triggered had finally passed. Rowan felt every eye in the room fix on him. Felt the particular vertigo of standing in front of an audience, while the most important question of his recent life waited for an answer. He thought briefly of every rehearsed response he might have given. Every careful, professional deflection that would have protected them both from this kind of public exposure. Then he looked at Celeste, at the almost smile now fully formed on her face, unguarded in a way he had never seen it in any boardroom before. And he said the words again, plainly, in front of everyone. "If you smiled at me even once," he said, "I think I would quit my job on the spot." The room, tense and silent only moments before, dissolved into unexpected laughter. Board members who had spent years watching Celeste Ashford maintain an unbreakable composure, now witnessing her laugh openly, freely, in a way that seemed to surprise her nearly as much as it surprised the room. She reached for Rowan's hand, an unguarded gesture entirely unlike anything the company had ever seen from her, and told him quietly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, that she had smiled at him considerably more than once by now, and he still, as far as she could tell, had not quit his job. The photograph from that boardroom moment, unlike the earlier stolen image taken through a restaurant window, was shared openly and without scandal, an entirely different kind of story circulating through the company by the end of the day, one of vindication rather than suspicion. Bianca Hale, watching from near the door, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile of her own, having quietly rooted for exactly this outcome, since the very first time she noticed her employer reading an architect's project notes with unusual attention. In the days that followed, Celeste told Rowan there remained one thing she had never fully explained. A piece of the story she had kept even from herself, until the chaos of recent weeks forced her to examine it honestly. She admitted, sitting across from him in the same small Capitol Hill restaurant, where their second real conversation had unfolded, that her attention to his work had begun long before the accidental message that everyone now credited with bringing them together. She had followed his project notes for nearly a year before that rainy night, drawn first by the unusual care in his designs, then, gradually and almost against her own guarded instincts, by the person those designs revealed him to be. The message had not created something from nothing. It had simply given her the excuse she had needed to stop pretending she had not already noticed him. Rowan absorbed this admission slowly, turning it over the way he turned over a difficult structural problem, testing it from different angles until it settled into place. He told her, honestly, that he had spent those same months entirely unaware of her attention, focused as he always was on the work itself rather than the people evaluating it, and that the idea of her watching quietly from the periphery of his professional life for nearly a year struck him now as both flattering and faintly unsettling. Though mostly, he admitted, it simply made him grateful for the accident that had finally forced the truth into the open. They did not rush the months that followed. Celeste continued running her company with the same disciplined focus that had built it, though those closest to her noticed subtle changes. A willingness to leave the office before dark occasionally, an ease in her posture during meetings that had not existed before, laughter that no longer felt like a rare and startling exception. Rowan continued his work as well, the waterfront project moving forward under renewed scrutiny that ultimately validated every original calculation his team had submitted, his reputation not merely restored, but strengthened by the very scandal that had briefly threatened to destroy it. The company, gradually, stopped calling her the Ice Queen. It happened without any formal announcement, without any deliberate campaign to rehabilitate her image, simply through the accumulation of small, witnessed moments. A genuine laugh in a hallway, a coffee shared with an architect who visited the office on ordinary Tuesdays, for ordinary reasons, a warmth that had apparently been there all along, waiting for circumstances patient enough to draw it out. Rowan never became wealthy through his relationship with Celeste, never allowed himself to be defined by the company she ran or the fortune attached to her name. He continued designing buildings that prioritized the people who would eventually live and work inside them, still difficult about material quality, still generous with his time toward junior designers who needed patient explanation rather than quick answers. Celeste, for her part, learned slowly what it meant to separate the architecture of her professional life from the architecture of everything else, discovering that the discipline which had built her company could coexist, carefully balanced, with an ordinary Tuesday evening spent doing nothing more remarkable than cooking dinner in a loft near Pioneer Square. Nearly a year after that first rainy night, on an evening carrying the same soft, persistent drizzle that had once sent her walking across the city in search of an answer she did not yet know she needed, Celeste stood at Rowan's window watching the same gold-smeared lights blur against the glass. She turned to him with the small, private smile that had become, over the months, entirely her own. Unguarded and easy in a way the rest of the world rarely glimpsed, and asked him what might have happened if he had never sent that message at all. If his thumb had landed correctly on the friend it was meant for instead of the stranger it found instead. Rowan considered the question seriously, the way he considered every question that mattered, and then took her hand, the same hand that had once trembled while opening a door to a woman he feared had come to end his career, rather than begin something neither of them had words for yet. He told her that without the accident, he likely would have spent years working up the courage to say something true, circling the feeling without ever daring to name it, protecting himself the same way she had once protected herself, mistaking caution for wisdom until the opportunity quietly passed them both by. Instead, he said, a single mistaken message had done in 5 minutes what years of careful hesitation might never have managed, delivering the truth before either of them had time to talk themselves out of it. Celeste laughed softly at that, resting her head against his shoulder as the rain continued its patient rhythm against the window. The city lights below reflecting off wet pavement in long, wavering streaks of gold and white. She told him, after a while, that she had started keeping the original card she sent him, the one delivered by courier with no return address, tucked inside a drawer in her office desk, where important papers rarely lasted more than a season before being filed away and forgotten. She kept it, she said, not out of sentimentality exactly, though she supposed that was part of it, but as a small private reminder that certainty sometimes arrived in the shape of an accident rather than a plan, that the careful architecture she had built around her own heart had needed, in the end, nothing more than an honest mistake to finally let someone inside. Rowan told her, in return, that he still had not deleted the message thread from that night. The one where a joke meant for Marcus had detonated quietly into something neither of them expected. He had thought about deleting it more than once, embarrassed by the memory of his own panic, but every time his thumb hovered over the option he found himself unable to finish the gesture, unwilling to erase the exact moment his life had changed direction without his permission. Some mistakes, he had come to believe, were simply truths that had not yet found the courage to introduce themselves properly. Marcus, when he finally learned the full story months later over drinks that had nothing to do with work, laughed so hard he nearly choked, insisting that he deserved at least partial credit for being the intended recipient of the most consequential wrong number in the history of Seattle real estate. Rowan agreed, generously, to name their eventual firstborn dog after him. A promise Celeste found considerably funnier than either man expected, and one that would, in fact, be honored the following spring, when a scruffy, good-natured mutt named Marcus took up permanent residence in the loft near Pioneer Square. Bianca Hale kept her own quiet satisfaction to herself for the most part, though she did allow herself, on the day Celeste finally moved a framed photograph of the two of them onto her office desk, the small triumph of reminding her employer that she had noticed the change in her reading habits nearly a year before either of them admitted anything to themselves. Celeste only smiled at that, the same easy, unguarded smile that had become so familiar to the people who worked closest to her, and told Bianca that she was, as always, entirely too observant for her own good.